There are books that whisper, books that disturb, and then there are books that seem to ignite something in the soul or awaken something darker. In 1888, Helena Blavatsky published The Secret Doctrine, a monumental work of esoteric philosophy that she claimed was not simply written, but transmitted from higher beings, from hidden masters, from beyond the veil of ordinary human knowledge. For her followers, the book was a revelation, a key to understanding the cosmos, the soul, and humanity's spiritual evolution. But for her critics, The Secret Doctrine was something else entirely: dangerous, delusional, or worse. A seed of ideology that, decades later, would be twisted by extremists for purposes Blavatsky never intended. What is in this book that made it so feared and so revered? Why has it been called forbidden? And how did a spiritual text from the 19th century become linked in some circles to the rise of one of the darkest ideologies of the 20th? This is not a story of blame, but of complexity, of how symbols can be misread, how teachings can be distorted, and how even seekers of light can be pulled into shadows not their own. To understand the controversy, we must return to Blavatsky's original message. We must dive into the heart of her teachings, into the idea of root races, cosmic cycles, and hidden masters. Only then can we begin to see how a mystical vision of human evolution was taken out of context and weaponized. Helena Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine is not an easy read. It spans thousands of pages and weaves together Eastern philosophy, Western esotericism, ancient mythologies, and a dense metaphysical framework. But at the center of it lies one of her most controversial ideas: the doctrine of the root races. According to Blavatsky, humanity did not begin with Adam and Eve, but has evolved through a series of root races, each one representing a stage in the spiritual and physical evolution of mankind. These races were not defined by skin color or geography in the modern sense, but by metaphysical qualities: the density of the physical body, the awakening of consciousness, and the relationship between spirit and matter. The first root race, she wrote, was ethereal, non-physical beings of light. The second became semi-physical. The third race, known as the Lemurians, were gigantic androgynous beings with limited intellect but great vitality. The fourth race, the Atlanteans, were advanced but eventually corrupted by materialism and magic. The fifth, our current race, is the Aryan. Here is where the problem begins. Blavatsky used the term Aryan in the classical Sanskrit sense, referring to noble qualities and spiritual awareness, not to a specific ethnic group. But in later decades, this term would be reinterpreted, stripped of its original meaning, and used for sinister political purposes. And so, a spiritual framework intended to describe inner evolution became the skeleton on which a racial hierarchy could be falsely constructed. Blavatsky's vision of evolution was deeply spiritual. For her, each root race wasn't better than the last in a material sense, but more refined in terms of consciousness. She wrote that each race was necessary, a phase in the soul's journey through matter back to spirit. But even within her own writings, contradictions and ambiguities appear. She often referred to the decline of certain races or to their degeneration, using language that, though metaphysical in intent, could easily be misread through a modern racialized lens. Terms like higher and lower began to blur the line between spirit and biology. Furthermore, Blavatsky, like many intellectuals of her time, was not free from the influence of 19th century ethnography and colonial bias. She often praised the wisdom of ancient India and Egypt, while portraying some contemporary societies as spiritually asleep or degenerated. Whether this was allegorical or literal remains debated. The true danger lay not just in what she said, but in how her words could be pulled apart, decontextualized, and reassembled by others with a very different agenda. In Germany, in the early 20th century, a new wave of occult and nationalist thinkers began to mine the secret doctrine for symbols and validation. They were not interested in spiritual ascent, but in power, purity, and control. And so the term Aryan was severed from its theosophical root and fused with an ideology that would come to justify the unthinkable. In the years leading up to World War II, Nazi occultism was not just fiction. It was a genuine current within the spiritual underground of Germany. Groups like the Thule Society, the Vril Society, and others drew on a strange mix of Nordic mythology, Eastern mysticism, pseudo-historical narratives, and yes, elements of Blavatsky's work. They interpreted the idea of an Aryan root race not as a metaphor for spiritual consciousness, but as a literal, biological destiny. They spoke of lost continents, of Atlantis and Hyperborea as ancestral homelands of a master race. And they reimagined Blavatsky's warnings about degeneration as justification for eugenics. Blavatsky herself had died in 1891, long before the rise of fascism. She never met Hitler, she never endorsed violence. But her ideas, or rather selective fragments of her ideas, were cherry-picked and remixed by ideologues hungry for mythological legitimacy. This is how esotericism can be dangerous, not because it is inherently evil, but because its symbols are powerful, ambiguous, and easily hijacked. It's important to understand that most modern theosophists reject any association with Nazism. They argue, with good reason, that Blavatsky's teachings were about spiritual unity, not racial division. But the damage had already been done. The vocabulary had escaped the page, and in the wrong hands, even light can become a weapon. To understand how such a misreading happened, we have to look at the context in which Blavatsky wrote The Secret Doctrine. The late 19th century was a time of colonial empires, racial theories, and a hunger for exotic knowledge. Anthropology, biology, and metaphysics were all tangled together in a web of spiritual speculation and scientific arrogance. Blavatsky sought to challenge materialist science, but often did so by blending spiritual insight with contemporary language that today feels archaic or problematic. She believed that the soul evolves, that human beings are part of cosmic cycles, and that ancient wisdom, especially from the East, held keys to truths forgotten by the West. But her use of terms like Aryan, Semitic, or Mongolian, intended as esoteric categories, were also words loaded with cultural and political baggage. Later readers, especially those with nationalistic agendas, read into these words meanings Blavatsky may never have intended. Some scholars argue that Blavatsky was naive, that she didn't foresee how her mystical cosmology could be distorted. Others suggest she was simply a product of her time, using the language available to her without fully grasping its implications. Either way, the result was the same. Her writings became a kind of Rorschach test. Visionaries saw wisdom. Racists saw justification, and the line between those two visions remains blurred to this day. Today, the Secret Doctrine continues to fascinate, confuse, and polarize. For some, it's a sacred text, a blueprint for spiritual awakening. For others, it's a relic of 19th century mysticism, full of obscure symbols and outdated ideas. And for a smaller, darker fringe, it remains a source of mythic legitimacy for racial supremacist fantasies. But what was Blavatsky's true intent? At its heart, her work promotes the idea of universal brotherhood, of humanity as a single spiritual organism evolving through lifetimes, civilizations, and cosmic ages. She wrote of karma, reincarnation, and the hidden laws of nature that guide our souls through cycles of growth and return. She criticized literal interpretations of religion, warned against dogma, and emphasized that all true wisdom traditions point toward the same eternal truths. So why then did she use the language of races and hierarchies? Some believe she was attempting to map spiritual evolution onto a historical timeline, to show how different cultures had carried the torch of wisdom across the ages. Others argue she was simply blending esoteric traditions like Hindu cosmology and Buddhist ideas into a Western framework. But even if her intent was pure, the language she used was open to abuse. And that's what happened. Ideas can't be controlled once they're released, and sometimes even the most spiritual teachings can be twisted into weapons, especially when the world is hungry for simple answers to complex fears. In the decades following World War II, theosophy itself faced a reckoning. Though most theosophical groups condemned the misuse of Blavatsky's work, the damage to public perception lingered. Her name, once associated with spiritual awakening, became entangled in conspiracy theories, accusations of fraud, and debates about esoteric racism. Some authors went further, accusing Blavatsky of being a hidden influence behind fascist mysticism, a claim that ignores both her pacifism and her philosophical complexity. Others defended her passionately, pointing out that her writing spoke of unity, compassion, and transcendence beyond race, gender, or class. Modern scholars now tread carefully. Some see Blavatsky as a flawed visionary, someone who opened a portal to higher knowledge, but did so with the imperfect tools of her era. Others see her as a mystic, whose ideas should be studied in context, not judged by misinterpretations decades later. What is clear is this: the Secret Doctrine is not a handbook of hate. It's a labyrinth of symbols, metaphors, and cosmologies, one that challenges the reader to think beyond material reality. But in the wrong hands, even metaphor becomes manifesto. Blavatsky's writings may not be to blame for what came after, but they were a door. And once opened, not everyone who walked through it did so with pure intentions. One of the most striking aspects of the Secret Doctrine is how much of it remains open to interpretation. Blavatsky claimed that her teachings came from the Mahatmas, advanced spiritual beings who communicated with her through visions, telepathic messages, and astral encounters. Whether one believes in these masters or not, their presence gave her work a mystical authority that was both compelling and controversial, but it also made her ideas harder to challenge. If a concept came from the Mahatmas, who dared to question it? Among those concepts was the idea that civilizations rise and fall in cycles, and that some are destined to fade, while others rise to carry the torch of wisdom. She described cultures as vehicles for spiritual development, implying that each had a time and purpose. But when these metaphysical ideas were read through a political lens, they took on a sinister tone. The Nazis weren't the only ones to misinterpret Blavatsky. Throughout the 20th century, fringe groups and occult circles continued to twist her ideas, linking them to alien theories, secret bloodlines, and elite conspiracies. The Aryan myth evolved far beyond its theosophical origin, becoming a tool of division instead of unity. It's a tragic irony. Blavatsky's entire philosophy revolved around the evolution of consciousness, of moving beyond race, beyond nation, beyond the illusions of separation. And yet, her words became fuel for ideologies rooted in the very illusions she sought to transcend. Today, many readers encounter the Secret Doctrine through second-hand accounts or cherry-picked quotes found on the internet. Often out of context, often in articles designed to shock or provoke. Few actually read the full work, and fewer still attempt to grasp the complexity of its metaphysical system. And yet, her influence is undeniable. Modern New Age spirituality, esoteric psychology, and even parts of quantum mysticism owe something, directly or indirectly, to the seeds planted by Blavatsky. Carl Jung studied her work, Aldous Huxley referenced her ideas. The concept of an interconnected human soul, evolving over lifetimes through karma and initiation, now permeates countless spiritual traditions. But the stain of association with fascist ideology remains. Not because she preached it, but because she left the door open wide enough for it to enter. So what do we do with her legacy? We can't rewrite history, but we can read it better. We can go back to the source, study it with discernment, and separate intention from distortion. Blavatsky was not perfect. She was a product of her time with all its contradictions. But she was also a pioneer, a woman in a man's world, a seeker in a materialist age, a bridge between East and West at a time when such bridges barely existed. Her greatest mistake may not have been what she believed, but how she expressed it. One of the recurring themes in Blavatsky's writing is the concept of illusion, that most of what we take as real is in fact Maya, a projection, a distortion of deeper truth. She warned that attachment to form, identity, or dogma could blind the soul. And yet the irony is clear. Her own teachings became subject to the very illusions she tried to dispel. In seeking to map the invisible, she used the visible, race, history, myth, as metaphors. But metaphors are dangerous when readers forget they're symbolic. When literal minds encounter mystical texts, what results is often confusion or fanaticism. The term Aryan is the most glaring example. In Sanskrit, it meant noble, not white. It referred to spiritual character, not genetics. But by the 20th century, that distinction was lost, and the word was hijacked. Would Blavatsky have approved of how her work was used? All evidence suggests no. She condemned fanaticism. She spoke out against cruelty, against rigid dogmas, against material power. Her heroes were sages, not soldiers. Her goal was inner awakening, not conquest. But ideas are like seeds. You can't control where they land or what grows from them. And so, the Secret Doctrine remains both a warning and a mirror. It reflects not just Blavatsky's brilliance, but the shadow of the world that read her. As the 21st century unfolds, we're seeing a renewed interest in esotericism. People are once again searching for meaning beyond science, beyond religion, in the realm of symbols, archetypes, and inner truth. In this landscape, Helena Blavatsky's name is re-emerging, but it's not enough to revive her work. We must interrogate it, celebrate its insights, and confront its blind spots. We must learn from its wisdom, and also from its misuse. There is value in the mystical, but only when paired with moral clarity. Blavatsky's intention was to unite humanity under a shared spiritual destiny, but her language, complex and often elitist, allowed that vision to be misused. This is not unique to Blavatsky. Many spiritual systems have been co-opted, from Christianity to Buddhism to indigenous traditions. The difference is that Blavatsky's system was already wrapped in obscurity and abstraction, making it more vulnerable to distortion. So how should we read the Secret Doctrine today? As a historical document, as a spiritual puzzle, as a cautionary tale, but above all as a reminder, words matter, symbols matter. And when we speak of evolution, whether biological, cultural, or spiritual, we must do so with care, because the line between mysticism and ideology is thin. And history has already shown us what happens when that line is crossed. In the end, the Secret Doctrine is not a forbidden book because it's evil. It's forbidden because it dares to describe a reality far more complex than most are ready to accept. It speaks in symbols, it speaks in riddles. It challenges the reader to think metaphysically in a world obsessed with the material. But its greatest danger is not in its content, it's in its misuse. Blavatsky wrote of souls, not races, of cycles, not supremacy, yet some saw in her words the echo of their own ambitions and shaped her ideas to fit their narrative. The damage that followed cannot be undone, but it can be understood. And understanding is the first step toward wisdom. So let this be a lesson, not just about Blavatsky, but about all teachings. Even those meant to liberate can be twisted into chains if we don't approach them with humility, context, and a willingness to confront the shadows they might cast. What we inherit from the past is not just knowledge, it's responsibility. And in reading Helena Blavatsky today, we must ask, are we seeking truth or power? Are we evolving inwardly, or simply borrowing symbols for egoic ends? The book is not the enemy, but what we do with its message, that is what defines us. Helena Blavatsky was many things: mystic, philosopher, rebel, and seeker. She traveled the world in search of ancient truths, challenged the rigid materialism of her time, and dared to suggest that humanity's purpose went far beyond the physical. Her vision was vast, flawed, brilliant, and dangerously open to interpretation. Her most famous work, The Secret Doctrine, is not a manual for hate. It's a complex map of spiritual evolution, written in the language of the 19th century, through the lens of one woman's mystical experience. But that map has been misread, its symbols twisted, and its power at times hijacked. We cannot ignore how some of its concepts were distorted in the darkest chapters of human history. But neither should we allow those distortions to erase the deeper questions it tried to ask. Where do we come from? Why are we here? And what are we becoming? The legacy of the Secret Doctrine is not only in what it says, but in what it reveals about us, the readers, our hopes, our fears, our capacity to see beyond form into essence, or to reduce essence into form. So before we judge the book or revere it or fear it, we must read it, carefully, critically, spiritually, because in the end, no doctrine, secret or not, holds more power than the one we write in our own hearts. If this story gave you new insight, like the video, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe mystical knowledge can still guide us? Or is it too easily corrupted? We're listening, and we're not afraid to question everything.